Today we're checking out the Universal Audio Aux, comparing it to real cabs, other attenuators, and going over the good, the bad, and whether or not it makes sense to buy one in 2025. What's up everybody, Mike here. It seems like the UA Aux was everywhere a few years ago. Like I remember seemingly every guitar and studio channel making a video on this thing, with pretty much all of them being exceptionally positive. A friend of mine recently lent me one to try out, so let's check it out. If you're not super familiar with the Aux, it's an attenuator, a load box, and a cab simulator with an accompanying app that lets you select between different cabs, mics, different room mics, and add some effects like reverb, delay, and compression, allowing you to record your actual tube amps without actual tube amp volume. So first, let's see how this thing does as an attenuator. I've got a couple of attenuators I use at the studio with some of my vintage amps that need to be cranked to get the sound I want, but are just stupid loud. Attenuators allow you to turn down the volume after the amp, so you still get all that lovely power amp compression and distortion, but without disturbing everyone within a 5-mile radius. First, we'll compare the Aux to both the amp without an attenuator, as well as my Audio Storm attenuator, to see if one does a better job of retaining the amp's tone. We'll use my Gibson Titan amp for this, because it's like the loudest thing known to mankind, so an attenuator is almost a must. I thought the Aux did really well here. It sounded a tiny bit brighter than the amp without an attenuator, and maybe lost a little something in the lows, but not bad at all. And I don't know how much of that change is from the attenuator itself, and how much is from the speakers themselves just pushing less air. But either way, I'd be perfectly happy using the Aux with this amp. The Audio Storm attenuator didn't fare quite as well. That one lost quite a bit of top end and seemed to push the mid-range. You could at least partially combat that with some EQ and it would probably be usable, but the Aux definitely did a better job in this test. And just to be thorough, let's do the same test against the THD hot plate using my Fender concert amp. This one won't quite be apples to apples, as the hot plate is 2 ohms while the Aux will be set to 4 ohms. So that might make a bit of a difference, but we'll see. In that test, I thought both attenuators did really well. There were some tiny differences, but they were totally close enough for me. And one nice thing about the Aux is that you can select between 4, 8, and 16 ohms with a switch on the back, so it'll work with pretty much every amp, which is really cool. There are some other attenuators that have multiple impedance settings, but most of them, especially the more affordable ones, are just a single impedance. So all in all, as an attenuator, the Aux gets a big thumbs up from me. But now let's get into how I assume most of you will be using the Aux, using the cab emulations to record your amps without using a real cab. We'll go a little deeper into all the tonal options in a minute, but I wanted to start out by comparing it with some real cabs. For this, both in the Aux app and on the real cab, we'll just be using a single SM57, both to keep things simple and to make the comparison as close and equal as possible. For the first comparison, we'll be using my Mesa single rectifier running into my Mesa oversized 412 cab, and the Aux on the 412 California V30 setting. All right, interesting. Both sounded cool, and either could totally work depending on the context of the track. But the biggest thing I noticed is how much tighter the aux sounded. Like, it kind of sounded like I put a tube screamer or something in front of it. And while a tighter sound isn't inherently better or worse, it kind of threw me off a little bit here. The Mesa Rectifier is a very loose sounding amp with this big, blooming, dynamic low end, and I felt like it lost a lot of that character with the aux. And again, in a lot of contexts, the tighter sound might work better. Tighter sounding amps are much more in at the moment in the heavy music world. But if that's what I was going for, I would probably choose a different amp, maybe a 5150 or something along those lines, not a Mesa. But now let's try another cab. Here's more of a rock tone from my Orange Rocker 30, going into the Vintage 30 in my Vox 412 cab, and the 412 UK V30 setting on the aux. So in this setting on the aux, I was hearing this annoying honky kind of sound, somewhere around 700 Hz, that was really sticking out. Let's EQ that out and compare again. Alright, now that sounded a lot better, and now I'd be happy using either of those sounds. Let's try one more cab comparison. This time I'll use my Vox AC15 going into the greenback in my Vox 412 cab, and compare that to the 412 GB25 punch setting on the aux. This one also had a little bit of that 700 Hz thing going on that would need to be dialed out, but otherwise sounded really good. So like I said, everything you've heard so far has just been a few of the cabs with a 57 in the off-axis position, but there are a lot more options. There are 22 cabs in total, ranging from a 1x10 Fender Champ to the Mesa 4x12 we heard earlier, and plenty of options in between. Then you have 6 mic options, covering some of the most common choices for guitar cabs, with an on-axis and off-axis option for each. You can also choose 2 different mics and blend them together. Let's just run through some of the different options so you can hear the range of tones you can get. And one cool little trick here. If you're using a 2-mic setup but want the option to change the balance between them after recording, just pan one of them all the way to the left and the other to the right and record both outputs. Now you've got each mic on a separate channel in case you want to make adjustments later. So while there are a ton of great tones to be had in this thing, there are a couple things that kind of bum me out. First, I really wish that they had more than just the 2 mic positions. A lot of the time, I found the on-axis position to be way too bright, but the off-axis position to be a little too dark. It'd be really cool if they had included a little slider or something to allow you to move the mic from the center of the speaker to the edge and anywhere in between. That would open up a lot more tonal possibilities and allow you to more easily find the sound you want without having to reach for an EQ. Then I think probably the biggest miss with this unit is that you can't load in impulse responses. Don't get me wrong, the sounds in this are good, and I think a lot of people would be perfectly happy using them exclusively. But including an IR loader would guarantee that everyone could get a sound they love. And if this was a cheaper unit, I'd probably be more forgiving. But the fact that it's a premium priced product, I would kind of expect it to be able to use IRs, especially considering all the more affordable options that can load IRs. For instance, I sometimes do sessions at a friend's place, and they don't always have the best or most extensive guitar gear collection. So bringing a head and an aux is a really cool solution, but it would be way cooler if I could load in IRs of my own cabs, allowing me to have all the sounds I'm used to using at any studio I go to. There is a kind of workaround if you really want to use your own IRs though. In the cab selection section of the app, you can choose direct, which won't apply any cab emulation, allowing you to use an IR loader afterwards. And again, if this was a cheaper unit, I'd be much more forgiving of having to do a workaround, but at $1,500, that's kind of a bummer. Speaking of bummers, there are no bass cabs in this thing. That seems like a pretty obvious oversight. Like, of course you can run a bass through any of the cab emulations that are included, but if they had just included an SVT 810 and a B15 cab, they could have covered pretty much every classic bass tone and doubled the usefulness of this box. Then I wanted to mention one little quirk with the aux app that probably won't matter to the majority of people, but could be a deal breaker for a few. And that's that the app only connects to the aux via Wi-Fi. Again, that's going to be totally fine for most people, but I know some people who keep their studio computer offline, or like my studio computer is connected to the internet via Ethernet and doesn't really get along well with Wi-Fi. So I need to bring my laptop to the studio if I want to dive into any of the settings on the app. The aux has USB ports on the back, but as best as I can tell, they don't do anything. It'd be nice if you could also use the USB to connect the aux to the app to cover pretty much everybody's needs, especially since the USB ports are already there. And the app works on computers or iPads, but I really wish it would work on phones too. I'm thinking for either a session guitarist or an engineer bringing an aux to different studios, if they want to access all the options in the app, they've got to bring a laptop or an iPad with them, which isn't the end of the world, but it'd be nice if it would work on your phone, since that's already going to be with you. And then we've got by far the biggest issue with the aux, and that's that the only officially supported operating systems for the app are Mojave and Catalina. There have been 5 operating systems since then that they haven't tested or updated for. That's wild. I've been using it on Monterey and it's been working, but I have no idea about anything more recent than that, or if it works on Apple Silicon chips. And like, this isn't a legacy product. They still sell this thing for $1,500, I might add. Yet you could be one operating system upgrade away from no longer being able to use 85% of the features. That's kind of messed up. They also don't mention that anywhere on the product page. You've got to dig a bit to find that. And I know if I just spent $1,500 on a brand new aux, I would kind of assume that it has full support for current operating systems. But nope, no updates or testing in 6 years now. But yeah, to wrap this up, is the aux a good product? Yes, for sure. Is it perfect? No. And would I recommend it to a friend? Probably not. It sounds good and it has some cool features, but it's also missing a few that I really think it should have at this price point. And most importantly, the operating system thing and lack of support is an absolute deal breaker for me on a product that relies so heavily on software. Depending on what features you need, there are a lot of alternatives from companies like Fryette, Sir, Two Notes, and Boss for a lot less money that could be worth checking out. And if you appreciate this video and want to help support the channel so I can make more gear reviews like this one, the easiest thing you can do is make your next gear purchase, whether it's an aux or a plugin or even a guitar cable, through my affiliate links down in the description. Thanks so much for watching and happy mixing.